I just went live, Selena. Today we're going to try to finish reading Turn by Morgan Rice, chapters 9 through 17. Caitlin woke up to complete darkness. She felt a cold metal pain on her wrist and ankles, and her limbs were sore. She realized she was chained, standing. Her arms were outstretched by her sides, and she tried to move them, but they didn't budge. Neither did her feet. She heard a rattle as she tried, and felt the cold, hard metal dig harder into her wrists and ankles. Where the hell was she? Caitlin opened her eyes wider, heart pounding, trying to get a feel for where she was. It was cold. She was still dressed, but barefooted, and she could feel cold stone beneath her feet. She also felt stone along her back. She was up against a wall, chained to a wall. She looked hard around the room and tried to make something out, but the blackness was absolute. She was cold and thirsty. She swallowed, and her throat was dry. She tugged for all she was worth, but even with her newfound strength, the chains did not budge. She was completely stuck. Caitlin opened her mouth to yell for help. The first attempt didn't work. Her mouth was too dry. She swallowed again. "Help!" she screamed. Her voice came out raspy. "Help!" she screamed again, and this time gained real volume. Nothing. She listened hard. She heard a faint swooshing noise somewhere in the distance, but from where? She tried to remember where she was last. She remembered going home, her appointment. She frowned, remembering her mom dead. She felt deeply sorry, as if somehow it were her fault, and she felt remorse. She wished that she could have been a better daughter, even if her mother wasn't great to her. Even even if, as her mama had blunted out the day before, she wasn't really even her daughter. Had she really meant it? Or was it just something she had thrown out in the time of anger? Then those three people, dressed in black, so pale, approaching her. Then the police, the bullet. How they stopped the bullet? What were these men? Why had they used the word human? She would have thought that they were merely delusional if she had not seen them stop the bullet in midair. Then the alley, the chase, and then blackness. Caitlin suddenly heard a creak of a metal door. She squinted as a light appeared in the distance. It was a torch. Someone was coming towards her carrying a torch. As he got closer, the room lit up. She was in a large, claustrophobic room, tourniquet from stone. It looked ancient. As the man got closer, Caitlin could see his features. He held the torch up to his face. He stared at her as if she were an insect. This man was Gortor's. His face was dislocated, making him look like an old, haggard witch. He grinned and revealed rows of small orange teeth. His breath thick. He came within inches of her and stared. He raised a hand to her face, and she could see his long, curved yellow nails like claws. He dragged them slowly along her cheek, not enough to draw blood, but enough to make her pulse. He grinned even more. "Who are you?" Caitlin asked, terrified. "Where am I?" He only grinned farther, as if examining his prey. He stared at her throat and licked his lips. Just then, Caitlin heard the sound of another metal door opening and saw several torches approaching. "Leave her," shouted a voice from the distance. The man standing before Caitlin quickly scurried away, backing up several feet. He lowered his head, astonishment. A whole group of torches approached, and as they got close, she could see their leader, the man who had chased her down the alley. He stared back, offering a smile with the warmth of ice. He was beautiful, this man, ageless but terrifying evil. His large charcoal eyes stared at her. He was flanked by 5 other men, all dressed in black like him, but none as large or as beautiful as he. There were 2 women in the group who stared back at her with equal coldness. You must excuse our attendant, the man said, his voice deep, cold, and matter of fact. Who are you? Caitlin asked. Why am I here? Forgive these harsh accommodations, the man said, running his hand along the metal chain that held her to the wall. We'll be more than happy to let you go, he said, if you only would answer a few questions. She looked back, unsure what to say. I will begin. My name is Kyle. I am deputy leader of the Black Tide Coven. He paused. Your turn. I don't know what you want from me, Caitlin answered. To start with your coven, who do you belong to? Caitlin racked her brain, trying to figure out if she had lost her mind. Was she imagining all of this? She thought she must be stuck in some sort of sick dream, but she felt the very real cold still on her wrists and ankles and knew she was not. She had no idea what to tell this man. What was he talking about? Coven? As in vampire? I don't belong to anyone, she said. He stared for a long while and then slowly shook his head. As you wish. We have dealt with rogue vampires before. It's always the same. They come to test us to see how secure our territory is. After that, more follow. That's how territory shifts begin. But you see, they never get away with it. Ours is the oldest, strongest, and covered in this land. No one kills here and gets away with it. So I ask you again, who sent you? When do they plan to invade? Territory invasions, Caitlin couldn't understand how she was not dreaming. Maybe she had been slipped some sort of drug. Maybe Jonah had slipped her something. But she didn't drink, and she never did drugs. She was not dreaming. This was real. Too awfully, incredibly real. She could have just dismissed them as a group of complex, crazy people, as some real cult or secret society that was completely dysfunctional. But after all that had happened in the last 48 hours, she actually found herself thinking twice. Her own strength, her own behavior, the way she felt her body changing. Could vampires be real? Was she one of them? Had she stumbled into the middle of some kind of vampire war? That would be just her luck. Caitlin stared back, thinking, had she really killed someone? Who? She couldn't remember, but she had this awful feeling that what he said was true, that she had killed someone. That more than anything made her feel terrible. She felt an awful feeling of pity and regret wash over her. If it was true, she was a murderer. She could never live that down. She stared back at him. I was sent by no one, she said finally. I don't remember exactly what I did, but whatever I did it on my own. I don't really know why I did it. I'm really sorry for whatever I did, she said. I didn't mean it. Kyle turned and looked at the others. They looked back at him. He shook his head and turned back to her. His glare turned cold and hard. You took me for a fool, I see, not wise. Kyle gestured to his subordinations, and they hurried off over and uncuffed her chains. She felt her arms drop and was relieved to have the blood flow back to her wrists. They uncuffed her ankles next. 4 of them, 2 on each side, got a tight grip on her arms and shoulders. If you don't want to answer me, Kyle said, then you will answer to the assembly. Just remember, you have chosen this. They will show no mercy as I may have done. As they led her away, Kyle added, make no mistake, you will be killed either way. But my way would have been quick and painless. Now you will see what suffering is. Caitlin tried to resist as they dragged her forward, but it was useless. They were leading her somewhere, and there was nothing she could do but embrace her fate and pray. When they opened the oak door, Caitlin could not believe her eyes. The room was enormous, shaped in a huge circle. It was lined with 100-foot tall stone columns ornately decorated. It was well lit. Torches placed every 5 feet all throughout the room. It looked like the Pantheon. It looked ancient. As she was let in, the next thing she noticed was the noise. It was a huge crowd. She looked around and saw hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women dressed in black moving quickly all about the room. There was a strangeness to how they moved. It was so fast, so random, and so inhuman. She heard a whooshing noise and looked up. Dozens of these people leapt or flew through the room, going from floor to ceiling, from ceiling to balcony, from column to ledge. That was the whooshing noise she heard. It was as if she had entered a cave full of bats. She took it all in and was completely utterly shocked. Vampires did exist, as she was one of them. They led her to the center of the room, chains round her bare feet, cold on the stone. They led her to a spot in the center of the floor, designed, designated by a large tile circle. As she reached the center, the noise gradually died down. The motion slowed. Hundreds of vampires took position in the huge stone amphitheater before her. It looked like a political assembly like the pictures she had seen of the State of the Union in dress, except instead of hundreds of politicians, there were hundreds of vampires, all staring at her. Their order and discipline was impressive. Within seconds, they were all perfectly seated, quiet as could be. The room felt solid. As she stood in the center of the room, held in place by the antennas, Kyle stepped off to the side, folded his hands, and lowered his head in reverence. Before the assembly sat in a moonstone chair. It looked like a throne. She looked up and saw the seat that seated in it was a vampire who looked older than the others. She could tell that he was absolutely ancient. There was something about his cold blue eyes. They were stare down at her as they have seen 10,000 years. She hated the feeling of his eyes on her. They were evil itself. So, he said in voice in a low rumble, "This is the one who breached our territory," he said. His voice was gravelly and had absolute no warmth in it. It echoed in the huge chamber. "Who is your current leader?" he asked. Caitlin stared back, debating on how to answer. She had no idea what to say. "I don't have a leader," she said, "and I don't belong to any coven. I am here by myself. You know the punishment for trespass," he stated, a smile growing at the corner of his mouth. "If there is anything worse than immortality," he continued, "it is immortality and pain." He stared at her. "This is your last chance," he said. She stepped back, having no idea what to say. Out of the corner of her eye, she scanned the room for an exit, wondering if there was any way out. She didn't see one. "As you wish," he said, and nodded ever so slightly. A side door opened, and out came a vampire in chains, dragged by two attendants. He was dragged to the center of the floor, only feet from where Caitlin stood. She watched in fear, unsure of what was happening. "This vampire broke the rule of mating," the leader said. "Not as severe as violation as yours, but still one that must be punished." The leader nodded again, and an attendant stepped forward with a small vial of liquid. He reached up and splashed it on the chained vampire. The chained vampire started shrieking. Caitlin watched his skin bubbled up all over his arms, walls appearing immediately as if he were burning. His shrieks were horrified. "This is not just any holy water," the leader said, staring down at Caitlin, "but especially charged water from the vacation. I assume you that it will burn through any skin, only that the pain will be horrified, worse than acid." He stared long and hard Caitlin. The room was completely silent. "Tell us where you're from, and you'll be spared an awful death." Caitlin swallowed hard, not wanting to feel that water on her skin. It looked horrific. Then again, if she were not truly a vampire, it shouldn't hurt her. But if it was not an experiment she wanted to take, she pulled at her chains again, but they did not give way. She could feel her heart pounding and the sweating rising on her brow. What could she possibly tell them? He stared at her, judging her up. "You're brave. I admire your loyalty to your coven, but your time is up." He nodded, and she heard the sound of chain. She looked over and saw two attendants hoisting a huge cauldron. With each pull, they raised it several feet in the air. It was high, about 15 feet off the ground. They swung it over so that it was directly over her head. There were about a few ounces of holy water splashed from that vampire, the leader said. Above you sits gallons. When it washes over your body, it will give you the most horrific pain imaginable. You will be in pain for a lifetime. But you will still be alive, immobile, helpless. Remember, you have chosen this. The man nodded, and Caitlin felt her heart pounding 10 times the speed. The attendants at her side hooked up her chains into the stone and ran, rushing to get as far away from her as possible. As Caitlin looked up, she saw the cauldron tilting, and the liquid began to pour. She looked back down and closed her eyes. Please, God, help me. No, she screamed, her scream echoing through the chamber, and then she was immersed. Chapter 10. The water covered her entire body, making it hard to breathe or open her eyes. After about 10 seconds, though, her entire hair and body and clothes were completely drenched. Kaylin blinked her eyes. She braced herself for the pain, but it didn't happen. She blinked and looked up at the cauldron, wondering if it was completely empty. It was. She looked back down at herself and saw she was drenched, but was completely fine, not an ounce of pain. The leader suddenly realized and stood in his chair, jaw dropped, and he was clearly shocked. Kyle, to turn and look, his mouth open. The entire assembly, hundreds of vampires, all stood in a gasp spread through the room. Caitlin could see that this was not the reaction they had been expecting. They were all dumbfounded. Somehow their water had not affected her. Maybe she wasn't a vampire after all. Caitlin saw her chance. While they were all stood there, too shocked to react, she summoned her strength and in one motion broke her chains and then took off at a sprint away from the assembly in the direction of the side door. She prayed it led somewhere. She made it halfway across the room before anyone could get over there, shocked to react. Get her! She finally heard the leader scream, and then the sound of hundreds of bodies wrestling towards her. The noise bounced off the walls, came from everywhere, and she realized that they were not just running towards her, but jumping down off the ceilings, off the balconies, down spreading speeding towards her. They swept down towards her like a vulture after its prey, and she doubled her speed, reaching for everything she had. She fumbled in the dark, only led by their torches, and she rounded a bend. Finally, in the distance, she saw the door. It was open, and light came from behind it. It was an exit. It was indeed an exit, and it would have been private except for that last vampire standing before the door, blocking her path, was a large, well-sculpted vampire, completely draped in black. He looked younger than the others, maybe 20, and his features were more treasured. Even in her haze, even with her life in such danger, Caitlin could not help but noticing how strangely attractive this vampire was. Still, he was blocking her only way out. She could not outrun the others, but she could not get past this man without going right through him. He opened the door even wider, as if making way for her to pass through it. Was he tricking her? She looked down and saw that he held a long spear in his hand. As she got closer, he held it up, aimed it right for her. She was only feet from the door now, and she couldn't stop. They were on her tail, and if she even slowed, it would have been the end of her. She ran right for him, closing her eyes and bracing herself for the inevitability impact of his spear running through her body. At least it would be quick. As she opened her eyes, and she saw him releasing his spear and she reflexively ducked. But he had aimed too high, way too high. She came to knock back and saw that he had not been aiming for her after her, but at one of the vampires who had been swooping down at her. The silver-tipped spear pierced the vampire's throat, and a hairless screech filled the room as the creature fell to the ground. Caitlin stared at this new vampire and wondered he had just saved her life. Go, he screamed. She picked up her pace and ran right through the open door. As she turned around, he turned with her and yanked the door closed with all his might, closing it firmly behind them. He quickly reached up, forced an enormous metal shaft, and placed it across the door, barricading it. He took several steps back, standing next to her, watching the door. She couldn't help looking at him, studying the line of his jaw, his brown hair and brown eyes. He had saved her life. But he wasn't looking back at her. He was still watching the door, fear in his eyes, with good reason. Within a second of his having buried it, a body hurled against it. The door was over 6 feet thick, pure steel, and the boards were even thicker. But it was no match. The bodies crashed into it from the other side, and the door was already mostly completely caved in. It would only be seconds until they crashed through. Move, he shouted, and before she could react, he grabbed her arm and led her away. He tugged at her, making her run faster than she had ever had, faster than she knew she could. And within seconds, they were down the hall, one hall, then another, and then another, twisting and turning every which way. The only thing they had to see were occasional torches, but she could never have made it out of there on her own. What's going on, Caitlin? Tried to ask as they ran out of breath. Where are we? This way, he yelled, yanking her suddenly in another direction. Behind him, Caitlin heard a crashing, followed by the sound of a mob bearing down on them. They reached a circular staircase made of stone, winding its way up along a wall. He ran full speed towards the steps, yanking her with him, and before she knew it, they were racing up the steps, twisting in circles, taking them three at a time. They were successfully ascending quickly. As they reached the top, it seemed to end in a complete wall. A stone ceiling was above them, and she couldn't see no other way out. It was a dead end. Where had he led them? He was confused too, and angry, but he seemed determined. He took a few steps back with a running start, charged at the ceiling. It was incredible. With the superhuman strength, he smashed a hole right through, stone crumbling, and light poured through. Real electrical light. Where were they? Come on, he yelled. He reached down and grabbed her arm, yanking her up and out through the ceiling and into the well-lit room. She looked about. It looked like they were in a courthouse or a museum. It was a great and beautiful structure. The floors were marble. The room was all stone columns. It was round. It looked like a government building. Where are we? He grabbed her hand and took off at a sprint, dragging her through the room at lightning speed. He charged a set of two huge steel doors. He let go of her wrist and ran right into them, leaning his shoulder hard. They flew open with a crash. She followed close behind, and this time not waiting. She heard the sound of stone moving behind her and knew that the mob was close and they were outside. Finally, in the cold night air struck her in the face. She was so grateful to be out from underground. She tried to get her bearings. They were definitely in New York, but where? Her surroundings seemed vaguely familiar. She saw a street sign, a passing taxi. She turned to look back and saw the structure they had just left, City Hall. The current had been beneath City Hall. They ran down the steps across the courtyard, heading to the street. They haven't gotten far from where they are when the noise of doors opening behind him and a mob of vampires. They headed right into a large iron gate. As they got close to security guard, they turned around and saw them running right for the gate, their eyes open wide and shocked, and they reached for the guns. Don't move, they yelled. But before they could react, he grabbed her tight, took three long bounds, and leapt for all he was worth. She felt them flying through the air 10 feet, 20, clearing the metal gate and landing on the other side with grace. They hit the ground running. She looked at her protector and the extent of his power was, wondering why he cared about her. and wondering why she felt so good beside him. Before she could think much longer, there was the crash of metal behind them, followed by gunshots. The other vampires had broken through, taking the police officers down with them. They were already close behind. They ran and ran, but it was not working. The mob was fast closing in. He suddenly grabbed her hand and turned the corner, taking them down a side street and ended in the wall. It's a dead end, she yelled, but he kept running, dragging her with him. He reached the end of the alley and dropped to a knee with a single finger, reached in and yanked up a huge iron manhole. She turned and saw the huge group of vampires heading right towards them, not more than 20 feet away. Go, he yelled, and before she could react, he grabbed her and shoved her into the hole. She grabbed the hold of the ladder. Looked as she looked up, she saw him get on his hands and knees, bracing himself. He raised the manhole cover as a shield. He was descended upon by the mob. He swung wildly, and she heard the impact as he knocked vampire after vampire away with the heavy iron. He was trying to join her to get into the hole too, but he couldn't make it. He was surrounded. She was about to climb up and help him when suddenly one of the vampires parted from the mob and slipped into the hole. He spotted Kate, then his and came right for her. She scrambled down the ladder, taking them 2 rings of the time, but it wasn't fast enough. He landed on top of her, and they both started falling. As she fell through the air, she embraced herself for impact. Luckily, they landed in water. As she rose, she saw she was up to her waist in filthy sewage water. She had barely time to think when the vampire landed beside her with a splash. With one motion, he wouldn't come back and backhand her across the face, then her flying salvo feet. She landed on her back in the water and looked up to see him pouncing again right for her throat. She rolled out of the way just in time, springing back to her feet. He was fast, but so was she. He fell flat on his face, got up and spun around and squared off in a rage. He clawed his right hand right for her face. She dodged it, and his hand barely missed her. The wind of it passed right by her cheek. His hand hit the wall with such force that it lodged it into stone. Caitlin was mad now. She felt the red hot rage pulse in her veins. She walked over to the dark vampire and wound back her leg and planted a strong kick right into his gut. He kneeled over. She then grabbed him from behind and threw him right into the wall, face first. His head hit the stone wall hard. She was proud of herself, figuring she had finished him off, but she was shocked by a sudden pain in her face and found herself backhanded once again. This vampire had recovered quickly, much more quickly than she had thought possible. Before she knew it, he was on top of her. He landed on her with a crash and brought her down. She was underneath him. His hand was on her throat and on it for real. She was strong, but he was stronger. He had an ancient strength that ran through his body. His hand was cold and clammy. She tried to resist, but it was too much. She dropped to one knee, and he kept squeezing. Before she knew it, he was pushing her head toward the water. At the last second, she managed to scream help. A second later, her head was submerged. Caitlin felt the dispersion in the water, the waves rushing, and knew that someone else had landed in the water. She was losing oxygen fast, unable to fight back. Caitlin felt strong arms under her and felt herself being hoisted up and out of the water. She jumped up and grasped for breath, sucking it in deeper than she had. She breathed again and again, hyperventilating. Are you okay? He asked, holding her shoulders. She nodded. That was all she could manage. She looked over and saw that her attacker lay there floating in the water on his back. Blood was oozing out of his neck. He was dead. She looked at him, his brown eyes looking down at her. He had saved her again. "We gotta move," he said, grabbing her arm and leading her sloshing through the waist-high water. That main cover won't hold them very long. As if on cue, the main cover above them was suddenly torn out. They ran. They turned down tunnel after tunnel and heard the sound of water splashing behind them. He made a sharp turn and the water level dropped down to their ankles. They picked up real speed. They entered yet another tunnel and found themselves in the midst of a major New York City infrastructure. There was massive steam pipes here and letting off huge chunks of steam. The heat was unbearable. He took her down yet another tunnel and suddenly picked her up and placed her on his back, wrapping her arms around his chest and ascended a ladder, taking 3 rings at a time. They were rising, and as he reached the top, he punched a being hard instead of flying up before them. They were back above ground on New York City streets, where she had no idea. "Hold on tight," he said, and she tightened her grip around his chest, clasping her hands into each other. He ran, and it turned into a sprint at a speed beyond which he had never experienced. She had a memory of riding on the back of a motorcycle once years ago, and the feeling of the wind whipping through her hair at 60 miles an hour. It felt like that, but faster. They must be doing 80 miles an hour, then 100, then 120. It just kept going. The buildings, people, cars, it all became a blur. And before she knew it, they were off the ground. They were in the air, flying. He opened his huge black wings, flapping slowly beside her. They were above the cars, above the people. She looked down and saw that they flew over 14th Street. Then a few seconds later, 34th. A few more seconds, and they were above Central Park. It took her breath away. He checked back over their shoulders, and so she did. She. She could barely see with the wind whipping in her eyes, but she could see enough to know that no creature was following them. He slowed a bit and then dipped, lowering their height. Now they flew just above the tree line. It was beautiful. She knew she had never seen Central Park this way. Its pathways led up the treetops right below her. She felt like she could reach out and touch them, and she had a feeling that it would never look as beautiful as it did right now. She clasped her hands tighter around his chest, feeling his warmth. She felt safe. As surreal as all this was, things felt back to normal in his arms. She wanted to fly like this forever. As she closed her eyes and felt the cool breeze caress her face, she prayed that this night would never end. Chapter 11. Hey, Mama. Kaden felt them slow and then began to descend. She opened her eyes. She didn't recognize any of the buildings around them. It appeared that they were way uptown, possibly the Bronx somewhere. As they descended, they flew over a small park, and in the distance, she thought she saw a castle. As they got closer, she realized that it was was a castle. What was the castle doing here in New York City? She racked her brain and realized that she had seen this castle before on a postcard somewhere. Yes, it was a museum of some sort. As they ascended a small hill, flying over its small medieval wall, she suddenly remembered what it was. The clusters. The small museum. It had been brought over from Europe piece by piece. It was hundreds of years old. Why was he taking her here? They descended smoothly over the outer wall and into a huge structure, stone turrets overlooking the Hudson River. They landed in darkness, but his feet touched down gracefully on the stone, and he gently led her off. She stood there facing him. She looked at him closely, hoping that he was still real, hoping that he wouldn't fly away, hoping that he was as gorgeous as he was the first time she saw him. He was, if anything, even more so. He stared down at her with his large brown eyes, and at that moment she felt herself get lost. There were so many questions she wanted to ask. She didn't even know where to begin. Who was he? How was he able to fly? Was he a vampire? Why had he risked his life for her? Why taking her here? And most importantly, was everything she had just seen a wild hallucination, Or did vampires really exist right here in New York City? And why was she one of them? She opened her mouth to speak, but all she managed was, "Why are we here?" And she knew it was a stupid question the moment she asked it, and hated herself for not asking something more important. But standing there in the cold March night, faced a bit numb, it was the best she could do. She, he just stared back at her. His stare seemed to pierce her soul, as if he were staring right through her. It looked as if he were debating how much to tell her. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, he opened his mouth to speak. "Caleb!" shouted a voice, and they both turned. A group of men, vampires, dressed all in black, marched straight for them. Caleb turned and faced them. "Caleb," she liked that. "We have no clearance for your arrival," the man in the middle said, deadly serious. "It's unannounced," Caleb answered quietly. "Then we would have to take you into custody," he said, nodding to his men, who slowly circled Caleb and her. "The rules?" Caleb nodded, unfazed. The man in the middle looked directly at Caitlin. She could see the disapproval in his eyes. "You know we can't let her in," the man said. "But you will," Caleb answered fiercely. He stared back at the men, equally determined. It was a meeting of the wills. The man stood there with, and she could see he was unsure what to do. A long silence followed. "Very well," he said, turning his back abruptly and leading the way. "It's your funeral." Caleb followed, and Caitlin walked beside him, unsure what to do. The man opened a huge medieval door, grabbing it by its brass ring. He then stepped aside, motioning for Caitlin to enter. Two more men in black stood inside the doorway, standing at attention. Caleb took Caitlin's hand and led her through. As she passed through the huge stone archway, she felt as if she was entering another century. "Guessing we don't have to pay admission," Caitlin said to Caleb, smiling. He looked over at her, blinking. It took him a second to realize it was a joke. Finally, he smiled. He had a beautiful smile. It made her think of Jonah. She felt confused. It was unlike her to feel strong feelings for any boy, much less for two of them in the same day. She still felt for Jonah, but Caleb was different. Jonah was a boy. Caleb, although he looked young, was a man, or was he, or something else. There was something about him she could not explain. Something that made her unable to look away. Something that made her not want to be beside. She liked Jonah, but she needed Caleb. Being around him was all incomposed. Camp's smell vanished quickly as it had appeared. He quickly shrugged. "I'm afraid there will be a much higher price for admission," he said, "if this meeting does not go as I hope." He led her through another stone archway and into a small medieval courtyard, perfectly systematic, surrounded on all four sides by columns and archways. This courtyard lit by the moon. It was very beautiful. She could not fathom how they were still in New York City. They could have been in Europe, in a European countryside. They walked across the courtyard and down a long stone hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing. They were trailed by several more guards, vampires, she wondered. If so, why were they so civil? Why didn't they attack Caleb or her? They walked down another stone corridor and through another medieval door, and then they suddenly stopped. Standing there was another man dressed in black who looked strangely similar to Caleb. He wore a large red cloak over his shoulders and was flanked by several attendants. He seemed to hold a position of authority. "Caleb," he said softly. He sounded shocked to see him. Caleb stood there, calmly staring back. "Samuel," he answered flatly. The man stood there, shaking his head just a little bit. "Not even a hug for your long lost brother?" Caleb asked. "You know this is very serious," Samuel answered. You have violated many laws by coming here tonight, especially by bringing her." The man did not even bother looking over at Caitlin. She felt insulted. "But I have no choice," Caleb said. "The day has arrived. War is here." A harsh murmur erupted among the vampires standing behind Samuel, and among the growing group of vampires forming behind them. She turned and saw that more than a dozen of them now circled them. She was starting to feel claustrophobic. They were vastly outnumbered, and there was no way out. She had no idea what Caleb had done, but whether it was, she hoped that he could talk his way out of it. Samuel raised his hands, and all the murmur died down. What's more, Caleb now continued, this woman here, he said, nodding towards Caitlin, and she is the one. Woman, Caitlin had never been called that before. She liked it, but she didn't understand the one. He had put a funny emphasis on the phrase as if he were talking about the Messiah or something. She wondered if they were all crazy. Another murmur arose and all heads turned to stare at her. I need to see the council, Caleb said, and I must bring her with me. Samuel shook his head. You know that I would not stop you. I can only advise, and I advise you to leave right now. Return to your post and await the council's summons. Caleb stared back. I'm afraid that is not possible, he said. You always done as you wish, Samuel said. Samuel stepped aside and motioned with his hand that he was free to pass. Your wife would not be pleased, Samuel said. Wife, Caitlin thought, and felt a cold chill ran up her spine. Why did she suddenly feel so insanely jealous? How had her feelings for Caleb developed that quickly? And what right did she have to feel so possessive of him? She felt her cheeks turn red. She did care. It made no sense at all, but she completely cared. Why didn't he tell me? Don't call her that, Caleb answered, his cheeks also burning red. You know that. Know that what? Came a woman's shriek. They all turned to see a woman marching towards them from down the hallway. She, too, was dressed in all black with long, flowing red hair that trailed past her shoulders and large, shining green eyes. She was tall, ageless, and strikingly beautiful. Galen had felt humbled in her presence like she had just shrunk. This was a woman or was it vampire? Whatever she was a creature that Caitlin could never compete with. She felt flattered, prepared to console Caleb to whoever she was. Know that what the woman repeated, staring partially at Caleb as she walked up to him just a few feet away, glancing over at Caitlin, and her mouth curled into a snarl. Caitlin had never seen anyone look at her with so much hatred before. Sarah, Caleb said softly, we have not been married for 700 years. In your eyes, maybe she's not bad. She started to pace, circling both Caitlin and Caleb. She looked her up and down as if she were an insect. How dare you bring her here? She spat. Really, you know, but for better. She is the one, Caleb said flatly. Unlike the others, this woman did not seem surprised. Instead, she just let out a short, mocking laugh. That's ridiculous, she answered. You brought a war on us, she continued, and all for a human. A simple infraction, she said, her anger rising. With each sentence, the crowd behind her seemed to get bolstered to grow with a concerned anger. It was becoming an angry mob. In fact, Sierra continued, we have the right to tear her apart. The crowd behind her began to murmur in approval. Anger flashed across Caleb's face. Then you would have to go through me, Caleb began staring back with equal determination. Caitlin felt a warmth run through her. He was laying his life on the line for her. Again, maybe he did care. Samuel stepped forward between them and held out his hand. The crowd quieted. Caleb has requested an audience with the council, he said. We owe him at least that. Let him state his case. Let the council decide. Why should we, Sarah snapped. Because that is what I said, Samuel answered, a steely determination in his voice. And I will give the orders up here, Sarah, not you. Samuel stared long and hard at her. Finally, she deferred. Samuel stepped aside and gestured towards the stone staircase. Caleb reached out and took Caitlin's hand and led her forward. They stepped down the wide stone steps and then descended into darkness. Behind them, Caitlin heard a sharp laughter cut through the night. Good riddance. Chapter 12. Their footsteps echoed on the wide stone staircase as they descended. It was then that Caitlin reached over and slipped her hand into Caleb's arm. She hoped that he wouldn't let it sit there. He did. In fact, he tightened his arm around hers. Once again, everything felt okay. She felt that she could descend into the darkness as long as they were together. So many thoughts raced through her mind. What was this counsel? Why had he insisted on taking her? Why did she feel so insistent on being at his side? She could have easily ejected up there, told him that she didn't want to go, that she rather wait upstairs, but she didn't want to wait upstairs. She wanted to be with him. She couldn't imagine herself anywhere else. None of it made any sense. At every turn, instead of getting answers, all she got were new questions. Who were all these people upstairs? Were they really vampires? What were they doing here in the cloisters? They turned the corner into a large room, and she was struck by its beauty. It was incredible, like descending into a real medieval castle. Soaring ceilings, caped rooms carved out of marble stone. Off to her right, there lay several sarcophagi raised above the floor. Incated medieval figures were carved on their lids. Some of them were open. Was that where they slept? She turned to think back to the all the vampire lore she had ever heard. Sleeping in coffins, awake at night, superhuman strength and speed, pain in the sunlight, it all seemed to add up. She herself felt some pain in the sun, but it wasn't unbearable, and she was more improved to the holy water. What more? This place, the cloisters, was filled with crosses. They were enormous crosses everywhere, yet it didn't seem to affect these vampires. In fact, this seemed to be their home. She wanted to ask Caleb about all of this and more, but he didn't know how to begin. She settled on the last one, the crosses, she said, and as they walked underneath another one. Don't they bother you? He looked at her, not understanding. Looked at her. He looked like he'd been lost in thought. Don't crosses hurt vampires? She asked. Recognition across his face. Not all of us, he answered. Our races vary from man, much like the human race. There were many races within our race, and many territories or coverings within each race. It is quite complex. They don't affect the benevolent vampires. Benevolent, she asks, just like the human race, there are forces for good and forces of evil. We are not all the same. He left it at that. As usual, the answers only raised more questions. But she held her tongue. She didn't want to cry. Not now. Despite the high ceilings, the doorways were small. The arch wooden doors were open, and they walked right through, darkened as they went. As they entered the new room, the height opened up again, and it was another magnificent room. She looked up and could see stained glass everywhere. To her right was some sort of pulpit, and before it, dozens of tiny wooden chairs. It was dark and beautiful. It was truly looked like some sort of medieval cloister. She saw no sign of life and heard no movement. She heard absolutely nothing. She wondered where they all were. They entered another room. The room sloping gently downward, and she gasped. This small room, was filled with treasures. It was a working museum, and they were all encased carefully behind glass. Right there before her, underneath sharp hologram lights, were what must have been hundreds of millions of dollars worth of ancient priceless treasures. Gold crosses, large silver goblets, medieval manuscripts. She followed Caleb as he walked through the room and stopped before a long vertical glass case. Inside was a magnificent ivory staff several feet long. He looked at it through the glass. He was quiet for several seconds. What is it? She finally asked. He kept staring quietly. Finally said, an old friend. That was it. He didn't offer any more. She wondered what sort of history he had with the object and what sort of power it held. She read the plaque, early 1300s. It is known as a crozier, a bishop's staff. It is both a rod and a staff, a rod for punishment and a staff for leading the faithful. The symbol of our church. It has the power to bless or to curse. It is what we guard. It is what keeps us safe. Their church, what they guard. Before she could ask more questions, he took her hand and led her through yet another doorway. They reached a velvet rope. He reached out, unclasped it, and pulled it back for her to enter. He then followed right behind her, reclasped it, and led her to a small circular wooden staircase, and it led down, seemingly right into the floor itself. She looked at it, puzzled. Caleb knelt and undid a secret latch in the floor. A floor trap opened up, and she could see that the staircase continued downward into the depths. Caleb looked into her eyes. Are you ready? She wanted to say no, but instead she took his hand. The staircase was narrow and steep and led into real blackness. After winding and winding, deeper and deeper, she finally saw light in the distance and started to hear movement. As they turned the corner, they entered another room. The room was huge and brightly lit, torches everywhere. It mirrored the upstairs rooms, identical with soaring stone, medieval ceilings, arch covering in intact detail. There were several traverses on the walls, and the huge space was filled with medieval furniture. It was also filled with people, vampires. They were all dressed in black, and they moved casually about the room. Many of them sat in various seats, some talking to each other, and the other covered under City Hall. She had felt evil darkness, had felt in constant danger. Here she felt strangely relaxed. Caleb led her across the long room right down the center, and they walked. The movement subsided, and a hush descended. She could feel all the eyes on them. As they reached the end of the room, Caleb approached a large vampire, taller than he was, and with much more broader shoulders. The man looked down expansively. I need an audience, Caleb said simply. The vampire turned and walked through the door, closing the door firmly behind her. Caleb and Caitlin stood there, waiting. She turned and surveyed the room. They were all hundreds of vampires staring at them, but no one moved to come closer. The door opened and the large vampire gestured. They entered. The small room was darker, dimly lit by only two torches. At the far end of the room, it was also completely empty, save for a long table on the opposite side. Behind it sat seven vampires, all strongly grown, grimly back. It looked like a panel of judges. There was something about these vampires which made them look much older. There was a harshness to their experience. Definitely a panel of judges. Counsel and Sergeant, the large vampire, yelled, banging his staff on the floor, then quickly exiting the room. He closed the door firmly behind them. It was just now the two of them facing the seven vampires. She stood tragically at Caleb's side, unsure what to say or do or say. An awkward silence followed as the judges studied them. It felt as if they were staring at their souls. Caleb came a growling voice from the vampire in the center of the panel. You have abandoned your post. I did not, sire. I did not, sire, he answered. I have kept my post faithfully for 200 years. I was forced to take action tonight. You take no action but for our command, he answered. You have jeopardized us all. My duty was to alert us of the for the coming war, Caleb answered. I believe the time has come. A grasp from the council. There was a long silence. And what makes you think that? They doused her in holy water and it did not burn her skin. Dark Town tells us that the day will come when the one will arrive and will be inquisitive to our weapons, and that she will head her war. A hushed gasp spread across the room. They all stared at Kate and then surrounding her. Several of the judges began talking amongst themselves until they finally the one in the middle slammed the table with his palm. Silence, he yelled. Gradually the murmur died down. So you risk us all to save a human? I saved her to save ourselves, Caleb answered. If she is the one, we are nothing without her. Caleb had spawned. She didn't know what to think. The one, guaranteeing, what was he talking about? She wondered if he thought she was someone else. though thought she was someone greater than she is. Her heart sank, not because of the way that the council looked at her, but because she began to worry about Caleb. Had only saved her for his own sake, that he didn't really care for her, and that his affection for her would disappear when he knew the truth. He would find out she was just an average, ordinary girl, no matter what took place over the last few days, and he would abandon her just like all the other guys in her life. As if to confirm her thoughts, the judge in the middle slowly shook his head, staring at Caleb with condensation. You have made a grave mistake, he said. What you failed to see is that you are the one who began this war. Your departure is what has alerted them to our presence. Furthermore, she is not the one you think she is. Caleb began. Then how do you explain? Another councilman spoke this time. Many centuries ago, there was a case like this. A vampire was immune to vampirism. People thought he was the Messiah too. He was not. He was just a half breed. Half breed, Caleb asked. He sounded unsure. The vampire by birth, one that was never turned. They were immune to some vampirism, but not to others. But that does not make them one of us, nor does it make them immortal. I'll show you, he continued, and suddenly turned to Caitlin. She felt nervous with his eyes staring through her. Tell me, young one, who turned you? Caitlin had no idea what he was talking about. She didn't even know what his question meant. Once again, this night, she found herself wondering what was the best answer to give. She hesitated, feeling that whatever she said would have a great impact, not just for her safety, but on Caleb's too. She waited to give the right answer for him, but she didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, she said. I don't know what you're talking about. I was never turned. I don't know what that means. Another council member leaned forward. Then who is your father? Of all questions, why hadn't he had to ask that? That was the question she always asked herself her whole life. Who was he? Why hadn't she never met him? Why did he leave her? It was an answer she wanted more than anything in her life, and now demanded she certainly could not prove it. I don't know, she said finally. The council member leaned back as if in victory. You see, he said, half breeds are not turned, and they never know their parents. You're mistaken, Caleb. You have made a grave error. Durrington states that a half blood will be the Messiah, and that she will lead us to the lost sword. Caleb snapped back downly. Darrington states that a half breed will bring the Messiah. The council member corrected, not be your passing words, Caleb answered. I am telling you that the war has begun and that she will lead us to the sword. Time is swift. We must have her lead us to it. It is the only hope we have. A child's tale, answered another council member. The sword you speak of does not exist, and if it did, a Hippolyte will not be the one to lead us. If we don't, others will. They will capture her, find it, and use it against us. You have committed a grave violation in bringing her here. Another one of them said from the far end of the counter, but I cannot begin. Enough, shouted the lead council member. The room grew silent. Caleb, you have knowingly violated several laws of our covering. You have abandoned your post. You have discarded your mission. You have sparked the war, and you have risked us all for a human, not even a human, but a half-breed. Worse, you have brought her here, right into our midst, endangering us all. We sentence you to 50 years confinement. You will not leave the grounds, and you will cast this half-breed out of our walls at once. Now leave us. I'm getting some water so I don't get dehydrated. Chapter 13. Caitlin and Caleb stood together on the large open terrace outside the cloisters, looking out at the night sky. Out at the night. Far off, she could see the Hudson River peeking out between the bare trees of March. In the distance, she could even see the tiny lights, of course, heading over the bridge. The night was completely silent. I need you to answer some questions for me, Caleb, she asked softly. After several seconds of silence, I know. Caleb asked, what am I doing here? Who do you think I am? Caitlin asked. It took her a few seconds more to summon the courage to ask the final question. Why did you save me? Caleb stared off into the horizon for several seconds. She could not tell what he was thinking or if he was even answer. Finally, he turned to her. He stared right into her eyes, and the power of his stare was overwhelming. She didn't look away if she tried. I am a vampire, he said flatly, of the White Coven. I have lived for over 3,000 years and have been with this coven for 800 of them. Why am I here? Vampire covens and races are always at war. They are territorial. Unfortunately, you stumbled right into the middle of it. What do you mean? She asked. How? He looked at her confused. Don't you remember? She stared back blankly. You're Kill. It ignited all of this. Kill. He slowly shook his head. So you don't remember typical first kills are always that way. He looked at her in the eye. You killed someone that's not even human. You fed on him in Cambridge Hall. Caitlin felt her world spinning. She could hardly believe that she was capable of harming anyone. Yet somehow, deep down, she felt it was very true. She was afraid to ask who it was. Could it have been Jonah? As if reading her mind, added the vocalist. Caitlin could not hardly take it at all. It felt too surreal. She felt she had just branded with a black mark that she could never undo. She felt awful and out of control. Why did I do it? You needed to feed. He answered. Why you did it there and then? And that is what no one knows. And that is what started this war. Were in another incumbent's territory, a very powerful covering. So I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He sighed. I don't know. This may be more to it than that. He looked at her. She looked at him. What do you mean? Maybe you were meant to be there. Maybe it was your destiny. She thought hard, afraid to ask the next question. Finally, she summoned her courage. So does that mean I'm a vampire? He turned away several seconds. He finally says, I don't know. He turned and looked at her. You are not a true vampire. You are not a true human either. You are somehow in between a half-breed, she asked. That's what they called it. I'm not so sure. What is it exactly? It is a vampire who is born into it. It is against the law or doctrine for a vampire to breed with a human. Sometimes, though, a rogue vampire will do it. If the human should give birth, the result will be a half breed. Not quite human, not quite vampire. It is very much looked down upon in our race. The penalty for interbreeding with the human is death. No exceptions, and the child is considered an outcast. But I thought you said that your Messiah will be a half breed. How can they look down on a half breed if it will be their servant? Such is the present paradox of our religion, he answered. Tell me more. How exactly is a half breed different? True vampires feed from the moment they are turned. Half breeds usually don't begin to feed until they come of age. She was afraid to ask the next question. When is that? 18. Caitlin thought hard. It was starting to make sense. She had just turned 18 and her career had just begun. Half breeds are also mortal. Caleb continued. They also die like regular humans. We on the other hand cannot. In order to be a true vampire, one would have to be turned by a true vampire. One who feed with the intent. Vampires are not allowed to turn just anyone. It also would inflect our race too greatly that they must receive permission in advance from the Master Council. Galen furrowed her brow, trying to take it on. You have some of our qualities, but not all. And since you are not a full breed, unfortunately, the vampire race will not accept you. Every vampire belongs to a coven. It is too dangerous not to. Unfortunately, normally I would petition to accept you in our ranks, but given that you are mixed, they will not never allow it. No coven will. Caitlin thought hard. If they were anything worse than finding out that she was something other than human, it was finding out that she wasn't truly something. Something finding out that she couldn't belong anywhere. She was neither here nor there, stuck between two worlds. So then, what was all this talk about the Messiah, about meeting the one? Our daring team, our ancient law tells us that one day a messenger, a Messiah, will arrive and lead us to the lost stone sword. It tells us that on that day, war will begin, a final all-out war between the vampire races, a war which will even drag in the human race. It is our version of the apocalypse. The only thing that can stop it, that can save us all, is the missing sword, and the only person that can lead us to that is the Messiah. When I witnessed what happened to you tonight, I felt certain that it was you. I have never seen any other vampire immune to such holy water. She looked up at him, and now he looked off into the horizon. I'm not sure of it. I'm not so sure. Caitlin stared at him. She felt desperate well enough, so she asked, afraid of the answer. Is that the only reason you rescued me? Reason you saved me? Because you thought I would lead you to some missing sword? Caleb stared back, and she could see the confusion in his face. What other reason would there be? He answered. She felt the wind and stuck out of her as if she had been hit by a bat. All the love that she had felt for him, the connection she thought they had, went rushing out with a single breath. She felt like crying. She wanted to turn and run, but didn't know where to go. She felt ashamed. Well, she said, fighting back tears, at least your wife will be happy to know that you were just doing your job, that you don't have any feelings for anyone else, or anything but some stupid sword. She turned and walked away. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away from him. Her feelings were just too overwhelming. She didn't know how to make sense of it. She had only gone few feet, when she felt a hand on her arm. He turned her back around. He stood there looking down at her. She's not my wife, he said softly. We were married once, yes, but that was 700 years ago. It only lasted a year, and the vampire race, unfortunately, they don't forget things easily. There are no amulets. Galen tossed his hand off her. Well, whatever she is, she'll be happy to have you back. Galen kept walking right down for the steps, and again he stopped her, this time getting around her and standing directly in her path. I don't know how I offended you, he said, but whatever I did, I am sorry. It's not what you didn't do, Caitlin wanted to say. It's that you didn't care, that you don't really love me, that I was just an object, a means to have an end. Just like every other guy I known, I had thought that this time maybe it was different, but she didn't say that. Instead, she just lowered her head and did her best to suppress a tear. She couldn't, though. She felt the hot tears stream down her cheeks. There was a hand on her chin, and he raised it, forcing her to look up at him. I am sorry, he said, finally sounding sincere. You're right. It was not the only reason I saved you. He took a deep breath. I do feel something for you. Ken felt her heart swell. But you must understand, it is forbidden. The laws are very strict on this. A vampire can never ever be with a human or a half breed or anyone else who is not a true vampire. The punishment would be death. There is no way around it. Caleb looked down. So you see, he finally continued. If I were to feel something for you, if I were to act for some motive other than for the general good, then it would mean my death. So then, what to become of me? She asked. She looked around. Clearly, I'm not walking here. Where am I supposed to go? Caleb looked down, shaking his head. I can't go home. I have no home left. The cops are looking for me. So are those evil vampires. What am I supposed to do? Go out there on my own? I don't even know what I am anymore. I wish I had the answers. I tried. I really did. But there's nothing more I can do. One cannot defy the council. It would mean both of our deaths. I'm sentenced to 50 years confinement. I cannot leave these grounds. If I did, I wouldn't be banished from my clan forever. You must understand. Caitlin turned to go again, but he spun her around. You must understand. You are merely human. Your life will end in 80 years, but for me, it's thousands. Your suffering is short, mine is endless. I cannot be banished for eternity. My covering is all that I have. I love you. I feel something for you. Something that even I don't understand. Something I never felt with anyone in 3,000 years. But I cannot risk leaving these walls. So, she said, I ask you again, what's to come of me? He looked down. I see, she answered. I'm not your problem anymore. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but this time she was gone, really gone. She made her way quickly across the terrace and down the stone staircase. This time she was really gone, heading into the Bronx in the dark New York City night. She had never felt more alone. 14. Kyle walked straight up down the stone corridor flanked by a small drove of vampires. They headed quickly down the hall, their footsteps echoing, one of his aides holding a torch in the front. They were heading deep into the corridor of command, a stubborn chamber which no vampire ever entered unless given permission. Calhoun had never been down this deep before, but on this day he was summoned by the Supreme Leader himself. It must have been serious. In 4,000 years, Calhoun had never been summoned, but he had heard of others who had. They had gone down there and not come back up. Kyle swallowed hard and walked faster. He had always believed that it was best to greet bad news quickly and get it over with. They came to a large open door guarded by several vampires who had stared coldly back. Finally, they stepped aside and opened the door. But after Caleb passed, they held out their staffs, preventing his entourage from following him. Colin entered, felt the door slam behind. Kyle saw dozens of vampires line up at attention along the wall, standing quietly on either side of the room. Front and center in the room, seated in a massive metal chair, was Rexus, his supreme leader. Kyle took several steps forward and bowed his head, waiting to be addressed. Rexus stared back with his cold, hard, icy blue eyes. Tell me everything you know about this human or half-breed, or rather, whatever she is, he began. And how about this spy? How did he infiltrate our ranks? Kyle took a deep breath and began. We don't know much about the girl, he said. We have no idea why the holy water did not affect her, but we do know we do know that she was the one who attacked the singer. We have him in custody now, and as soon as he recovers, we expect him to lead us to her. He was turned by her. He has her sin in his blood. What coven does she belong to? Roxas asked. Kyle stubborn in the darkness, choosing his words carefully. We think she's just a rogue vampire. Do you know anything? Kyle felt his cheeks redden. So you brought her into our midst without knowing anything about her, Roxas said. You endangered our entire coven. I brought her into to incriminate her. I had no idea she would be me. And what of the spy, Roxas asked, cutting him off. Kyle swallowed. Caleb, we brought him in 200 years ago. He had proven his loyalty many times. We never had no reason to suspect him. Who had recruited him? Rex's asked. Kyle's paused. He swallowed hard. I did. So, Rexus said, once again you allowed a threat into our ranks. Rexus glared back. It wasn't a question, it was a statement and filled with condemnation. I'm sorry, Master Cow said, bowing his head. But in my defense, no one here, not only one vampire, ever suspected Kip. On many occasions, Russia's racist and Cow stopped. You have forced me to initiate the war. I would have to now have to redirect all of our resources. A master plan will now have to be put on hold. I'm sorry, Master. I'll do whatever I can to find them and make them pay. I'm afraid it's too late for that. Cal swallowed hard, bracing himself for what might come next. If it was death, he was prepared. I am no longer the one you need to answer to. I myself have been summoned by the Supreme Council. Cal's eyes widened. He had heard rumors all his life of the Supreme Council, the governing body of vampires who even the Supreme Leader had an answer to. And now he knew that it was real, and that they were summoning him. He swallowed hard. They are very unhappy with what went on here today. They want answers. You will explain the mistake you made, why Shakespeare, why Spy infiltrated our ranks, and our plans for purging other spies. We will then expect their judgment and sentence. Kyle slowly nodded, terrified for what would come. None of it sounded good. We meet at the next new moon. That gives me you time. In the meantime, I suggest you find this half breed. If you can, it may save your life. I promise my master I will summon every one of our vampires and I will lead the charge myself. We will find her and I will make her pay. 15. Jonah sat in the police station very afraid. On one side of him sat his dad, looking more nervous than Jonah had ever seen him. And on the other side, his newly hired lawyer. Across from them in the small, bright negotiation sat 5 police detectives. Behind them stood 5 more, all pacing and agitated. It was the biggest news story of the day. Not only had an internationally acclaimed vocalist had been murdered right during his debut performance right in Cameron Chaw. Not only had he been murdered in a suspicious way, but things had managed to get even worse. When the police followed up on the only lead when they had to visit her apartment, 4 policemen were killed. To say that things had escalated was to put it mildly. Not not only were there either the Beethoven butcher or Carriage Hall killer, as some people were calling her, but they were also other cop killer, a four cop killer. Every cop in the city was on the case, and no one would rest until it was solved. And the only lead they had was sitting across the table from them, Jonah, her guest of the evening. Jonah sat wide-eyed, feeling the drops of sweat forming again on his forehead. This was his 7th hour in the room. During the first 3 hours, he had constellationally wiped the sweat from his hairline. Now he just let the sweat trickle down his side of his face. He slumped in his chair, defeated. He just didn't know what else to add. Cop after cop entered the room, all asking the same questions, all variations on a theme. He had no answers. He couldn't understand why they kept asking him the same thing over and over. How long have you known her? Why did you bring her to this event? Why did you leave her at intermission? Why didn't you follow her? How had this all come to his? She even showed up looking so beautiful. She was so sweet. He loved being with her and talking to her. He was sure it was going to be a dream date. Then she started acting strangely. Shortly after the music began, he felt a restless building in her. She had seemed sick, but wasn't seemed sick wasn't the word. She had seemed antsy. More than that, she had seemed like she was going to burst out of her skin, like she had to get somewhere, and that somewhere fast. At first, he had thought it was just because she wasn't like in the concert. He wondered if taking her there was a bad idea. Then he wondered if maybe she just didn't like him. But then it seemed to grow more intense, and he could almost feel the heart heat radiating out of her skin. He had then started to wonder if maybe she had some kind of sickness, maybe food poisoning. When she actually burst out of the place, he wondered if she was running to the bathroom. He was puzzled, but he waited patiently by the doors. I'm sure she would come back after intermission. But after 15 minutes, after the final bell rang, he had gone back to his seat, alone, confused. After another 15 minutes had gone by, the lights in the entire room had been raised. A man had came back on stage and had announced that the concert would not continue, that refunds would be issued. He did not say why. The entire crowd had gasped annoyed, but mostly puzzled. Jonah had been attending concerts his entire life. He had never seen one stop at an intermission. Had the vocalist taken sick? Jonah, the detective snapped. Jonah looked up at her and startled. The detective stared back down angrily. Grace was her name. She was the toughest cop he had ever met, and she was relentless. Did you not hear what I just asked you? Jonah shook his head. I want you to tell me again everything that you know about her. Tell me again how you met. I answered that question a million times already. Bless you. And Jonah is frustrated. I want to hear it again. I met her in class. She was new. I gave her my seat. Then what? We got to talking a little bit. We saw each other in the cafeteria. I asked her out. Bless you. She saw each other in the cafeteria. I asked her out. She said yes. That's what it was. Then that was it. The detective asked. There were absolutely no other details, no other thing to add. Jonah debuted with himself over how much to tell them. Of course, there was more. There was his getting beat up by bullies. There was her journal lying mysteriously behind him. His suspicion that she had been there, that she had helped him, that she had even beat up the guy somehow. How he had no idea. But what was he supposed to tell the cops? That he had gotten himself beat up? That he thinks he remembered seeing her there? That he thinks he remembers seeing her beat up four guys twice her size? None of it made sense, not even to him. It certainly wouldn't make sense to them. They just think he was lying, making stuff up, and they were out for her, and he wasn't going to help. Despite everything, he felt protective of her, and he couldn't really understand. He couldn't really understand what had happened. A part of him didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. Had she really killed the vocalist? Why? Were there really two holes in his neck, like the paper said? Had she bit him? Was she some kind of Jonah? Grace snapped. I said, is there anything else? The detective stared down at him. No, he said. Finally, he hoped she couldn't tell he was lying. A new detective stepped forward. He leaned over and stared right into Jonah's eyes. Did she say anything that night indicate that she was mentally unstable? Jones frowned his brow. You mean crazy? Why would I think that? She was great company. I really like her. She's smart and nice. I like talking to her. Is exactly what did y'all talk about? It was the female detective again. Beethoven. Johnny answered. The detectives looked over at each other by the confused, unpleasant expression on their faces. One of them, imagine he said, pornography. Beethoven, one of the detectives, a beefy guy in his 50s, asked in a mocking voice. Jonah was exhausted and he felt like mocking him back. He's a composer, Jonah said. I know who Beethoven is, you little punk, the detective snapped. Another detective, a beefy man in his 60s with large red cheeks, took three steps forward and put his meaty hands on the palms on the table and leaned in close enough so that Jonah could smell his bad coffee breath. Look, pal, this isn't a game. Four cops are dead because of your little girlfriend, he said. Now, we think you know. where she's hiding. He said, "You better start open up." And Jonah's lawyer, Harrison, that is conjecture detective. You cannot accuse my client of. I don't give a damn about your client. The detective screamed back, and tense sounds followed over the room. Suddenly, the door opened, and in walked another detective wearing latex gloves. He carried Jonah's phone in one hand and placed it on the table next to him. Jonah was happy to see it. "Anything?" asked one of the detectives. The cop with the gloves took them off and threw them in the waistbag. He shook his head. "Nothing. The kid's phone is clean. He got a few texts from her right before the show, but that was it. We tried her number, did. We're pulling all the numbers from her, all her phone records now. Anyway, he's telling the truth. Before yesterday, she never called or texted him once." "I told you," Jonah snapped back at the cops. "Detectives, we are through here." Jonah's lawyers asked. The detectives turned and looked at each other. "My client has committed no crime and done nothing wrong. He has cooperated internally with your investigation, answering all of your questions. He has no intention of leaving the state or even the city. He is available for questions anytime. I ask now that he be excused. He is a student and he does have school in the morning." The lawyer looked down at his watch. It's almost 1 a.m., gentlemen. At that moment, a loud bell rang in the room, caused by a strong vibration. All eyes in the room suddenly turned to Jonah's phone. Sitting there on the metal table, it vibrated again and lit up. But before Jonah could reach it, he saw who it was from, as did everyone else in the room. It was from Caitlin. She wanted to know where he was. 16. Caitlin checked her phone again. It was 1 a.m. She had just texted Jonah, no response. He was probably asleep, or if awake, he probably wouldn't even want to hear from her. But it was the only thing she could think of doing. As she walked away from the crossroads in the fresh night air, she heard her head started to clear. The further she got from the place, the better she felt. Caleb's presence, his energy, slowly lifted from her, and she began to feel like she could think clearly again. When she had been with him for some reason, she been unable to think clearly for herself. His presence has been all consuming. She found it impossible to think of anything or anyone else. Now that she was on her own again and away from him, thoughts of Jonah flooded back to her. She felt guilty for liking Caleb at all. Felt like somehow she had betrayed Jonah. Jonah had been so kind to her. Jonah had been so kind to her in school and so good to her on their days. She wondered how he felt about her now, running out like that. He probably hated her. She walked through Fort Tryon Park and checked her phone again. Luckily, it was a tiny phone, and she had hidden it well in the tiny inside pockets of her tight dress. Somehow, it has survived through all this, but the battery had not. It had been almost 2 days without charging, and she looked down and saw it was redlining. There were only a few minutes left before it did die completely. She hoped that Jonah would answer her before then. If not, she had no way to reach him. Was he sleeping? Was he ignoring her? She couldn't blame him. She would have ignored her too. Caitlin walked through the park. She had no idea where she was headed. All she knew was that she needed to get far away from that place, from Caleb, from vampires, from all of this. She just wanted her normal life back. In the back of her mind, she thought that if she walked far enough and long enough, maybe all of this would just disappear. Maybe the rising sun would bring a new day, and this would be all washed away as a bad dream. She checked her phone. It was flashing out almost completely. That she knew from experience that she had about 30 seconds left until it was dead. She stared at it entire time and flashed, hoping, praying that Jonah would respond. That he would only call and say, "Where are you? I'll come right away." Then he would rescue her from all of this. But As she watched, it suddenly went black, dead, completely dead. She tucked her phone back into her pocket, resigned, resigned to her new life, resigned to having no one left. She would have just to rely on herself like she had always done. She exited front Fort Tyrone Park and was in the Bronx, back on the city grid. It gave her a sense of normalcy, of direction. She didn't know exactly where to go, but she liked that she was heading towards Midtown. Yes, that was where she would go, Penn State. She would catch a train, get far away from all this, maybe go back to her previous town. Maybe her brother would still be there and she could start over again, act as if all this never happened. She looked around, graffiti everywhere, hustlers on every corner. But somehow this time they left her alone. Maybe they realized that she was at the end of her rope, that there was nothing left to take from her. She saw us on 186th Street. It would be a far walk, 150 blocks to Penn State. It would take all night, but that was what she wanted, to clear her head of Caleb, of Jonah, of the events of the last 2 nights. She saw another future ahead of her, and she was ready to walk all night. 17. When Caitlin woke, it was morning. She could feel more than she then see the sunlight striking her, and she groggily raised her head to get her bearings. She felt cold stone touching the skin of her arms and forehead. Where was she? As she raised her head, she looked around. She realized she was in Central Park. She remembered now that she had stopped along the way, sometime during the night, to take a rest. She had been so tired, so weary. She must have fallen asleep, sitting up, leaning over and resting her arms and head on the marble railing. It was already mid-morning, and people streamed through the park. One lady with her young daughter walked by and gave her a strange look. She pulled her daughter close as they passed. Caitlin sat up straighter and looked around. A few more people stared at her, and she wondered what they must have thought. And she looked down at her dirty clothes. They were covered in grime at this point. She really didn't care. She just wanted to get out of the city, this place which she associated with everything going wrong. Then it hit her. Hunger, pain struck, and she felt hungrier than she ever had, but it wasn't a normal hunger. It was an insane primal urge to feed, like she had felt in King of Chalk. A small boy playing with a soccer ball no lower than six kicked it by accident right near her, and he came running over towards her. His parents were far ahead, at least 30 feet. Now was her chance. Every bone in her body screamed to feed. She stared at his neck, zoomed in on the pulsing blood. She could feel it, almost smell it. She wanted her to pounce, but somehow some part of her stopped herself. She knew that she would starve if she didn't feed, that she would die shortly, but she would rather die than harm him. She let him go. The sunlight was bad but bearable. Was that because she was a half-breed? How could it have affected other vampires? Maybe this gave her some kind of edge. She looked around, blinking at the harsh sunlight, and felt dazed and confused. There were so many people, so much commotion. Why had she stopped here? Why had she been going? Yes, Penn State. She felt the pain in her weary feet, sore from all the walking. But she wasn't far now, not more than 30 blocks. She walked the rest of the way, catch a train, and get the hell out of here. She would urge herself out of sheer will to become normal again. If she got far enough from the city, maybe, just maybe, that would happen. Caitlin stood slowly, preparing to walk. Freeze, a voice screamed. Don't you move, another voice yelled. Turned slowly. Before her were at least a dozen uniformed New York police officers, all with their guns drawn and pointed. They kept their distance about 15 feet away, as if afraid to get any closer, as if she was some sort of wild animal. She looked back at them and strangely was unafraid. Instead, she felt a strange sort of peace rise within her. She was beginning to feel stronger than the humans, and with every passing moment, she felt less and less a part of their race. She felt a strange sense of invincibility, felt that no matter how many of them there were or what weaponry they had, she could outrun them or outfight them. On the other hand, she felt tired, resigned. A part of her really didn't want to run anymore from the cops from Vampire. She knew know where she was going, where she was. She didn't really know where she was running to, or really what she was running from. In some weird way, she would welcome being hauled off by the police. Getting arrested would at least be something normal, rational. Maybe they would shake her up and make her realize that she was just human after all. The officer slowly, warily approached her, guns drawn and moving with the utmost caution. She wanted them to come closer, more interested than afraid. Her sense had heightened. She noticed that every detail, the detailed shape of the guns, the count of their triggers, even how long their fingernails were. You get those hands up where we can see them. If cops screamed, the closest cops were on the feet away. She wondered what her life would have been like if her father had never left, if they had never moved, she had a different mom, if they stayed put in one of the towns, if she had a boyfriend, would she have ever been normal? Would life have ever been normal? Would life have ever been normal? The closest cop was only a few feet away. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, the cop said slowly. She slowly lowered her arms, turned, and placed her arms behind her back. She could feel the cop wrap her tightly around one wrist and the other one dragging behind her to roughly too high, using unnecessary force. How petty. She felt the cold clamps of the hand because you could feel the metal cut into her skin. The cop grabbed her by the back of her head, squeezed her hair way too tightly and closed, putting his mouth beside her ear. He whispered, "You're going to fry." And then it happened. Before she knew what was happening, there was a sickening noise of crunching bone, followed by the splatter of blood and the feel and smell of warm blood all over her face. She heard shouting and screaming, and then shots fired in the fraction of a second. It wasn't until they impatiently dropped to her knees and hit the ground, spun around and looked up, that she realized what was happening. The cop who had handcuffed her was dead, decapitated, his head severed in half. The other cops were firing wildly, but they were outmatched. A mob of vampires, the same ones from the city hall, had descended. They were tearing the cops to pieces. The cop managed to shoot some of them, but it didn't do any good. They kept on charging. It was a bloodbath. Within a matter of seconds, the cops were torn to pieces. Caitlin Sullivan felt the warm, familiar rush through her blood, felt the power filling her, her, raising up from her feet through her arms and shoulders. She reached back and snapped the cuffs clean. She brought her hands in front of her and stared, shocked at her own strength. The metal dangled on each wrist, but her hands were now free, and she jumped to her feet, watching with fraction the gruesome scene in front of her. The entire mob of vampires hung over the cops' bodies. They seemed to just starting to notice her. She realized she needed to escape fast, but just before she could finish the thought, she felt an icy, super strong grip on the back of her neck. She looked over and recognized the face. It was Kyle. He had the look of death. He grinned at her and said, "We are not saving you," he said. "We are simply taking what is ours." She turned to Reese. She swung her arm around, but he blocked it easily and grasped her by the throat. She was losing air. She was simply no match for him. "You may be immune to some things," he said, "but you're not nearly as strong as I, nor will you ever be." At the moment, there was another blur of motion, and Caitlin could suddenly breathe again. She was shocked to see Kyle. suddenly stumbling backwards. He went hurtling back with such force that he was smashed backwards into the marble ground, shattering it and went flying over it its side. She looked over and saw what had done it. Caleb. He was here. Before she could even process what was happening, Caleb felt this familiar grip around her waist, his muscular arm and torso, and felt herself being held by him, and ran faster and faster, just as they had the night before. They ran through Central Park, heading south. In the moments, the trees became a blur. They lifted up into the air. Once again, they were flying. They were up in the air over the city when Caleb spread his wings, wrapped them around her. I thought you couldn't leave, Caleb finally said. I can't. So does that mean you'll be banished? Yes. She felt overcoming emotion. He hadn't given it all up for her. As they flew higher and higher, almost into the clouds, Caitlin saw and had no idea where they were going. She looked down and could see that they were leaving the city. She was so happy to be away from it all, so ready for a fresh start. Most of all, she was happy to be in Caleb's arms. The sky before them broke into a soft orange glow, and she only wished that this moment would never end. That's the end of Turn by Morgan Rice. Leave in the comments what y'all think of it, and I will try to get love from the library to read it and get through it all for all of you. Peace.